Feed the neighborhood with a tailgate-ready Big Bow Box. It's bow time.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Extra Points. This is Colby, Reece, and joining me as always are the sports editors of The Breeze, Kaiden Bridges, and Jackson Hephner. And today we're here to preview JMU football's game at Georgia State. JMU's 8-0 after defeating ODU barely. Coach Signetti said it should be a wake-up call for his team. What did y'all see in that ODU game for JMU to be able to get the 30-27 win?
Right. They kind of just won by the skins of their teeth. I think the Dukes were exposed in a way they hadn't been this season, especially in the run game from ODU, and quarterback Grant Wilson was able to make some really explosive plays over the top. So just some reoccurring issues we saw from the pass defense early on this season, but then their run game exposing the defense and running 138 yards on them, the most out of any team this season. So I think it was just kind of an off week, it felt like. So hopefully, like you said, it was a wake-up call for them and they can remain consistent heading into the week against the Panthers.
Yeah, I think defensively there were a lot of issues in this game that we had kind of seen earlier in the year. I think the Utah State game comes to mind for me. Just kind of looking back, that wasn't a great performance by them whatsoever. And while they'd moved past that, they had some really dominant wins against Georgia Southern and Marshall. I think this game, some of those early season issues, especially in the pass defense, like Kaiden mentioned, really started to rear their ugly head. I will say, though, I think the offense performed a lot better than they have. I think the offense has continually improved as the year has gone on. McLeod finished with 340 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. So, not terrible. Of course, one of those interceptions was very debatable, so you don't really know. I don't know how much stock I would put in on the, 3-2 ratio there. But just overall, I think, especially when you look at some of the receivers really stepping up. Sophomore wide receiver Elijah Surratt finished with over 100 yards and a touchdown. Senior wide receiver Reggie Brown finished with 5 catches for 160 yards and 2 touchdowns. Those both really carried the offense and was really able to get a lot of production that the Dukes ended up needing to pull out a win.
Yeah, and you mentioned a lot of the star performers from that game. Obviously, McLeod, 2 interceptions, one on the opening drive you would want to kind of not have. And Kaelon Black had 76 rushing yards, but Kirk Cincinnati really wants to see his team just rush more consistently. It feels like the team can't really have explosive plays on the ground, so he really wants to see that this week. So what do y'all see as the key areas for this offense heading into the game against the Panthers?
Honestly, it just every week just continuing to click and gel, as Jordan McLeod mentioned after Marshall, and Elijah Surratt and Reggie Brown have both mentioned it recently. Just the offense continues to improve, and I feel like we've said that all season. But it's really, I think, becoming a prominent key point, especially for the players themselves. They continue to talk about it, how each week they just continue to get better, and especially with, as we mentioned earlier, Surratt and Brown kind of emerging as those consistent leaders and are making those big plays with Jordan. I think it's really good to see, and it's definitely going to be needed this weekend.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is just, we're starting to get to a point where the offense, they have their reliable contributors. Obviously, McLeod has gotten a lot better at, running that offense, but you also have, you talk about Brown and Surratt really stepping up as sort of the top 2 receivers, and then you have that 3-headed monster they got in the running back room, Kaelon Black, Latrell Palmer, Tyson Lawton. Those 3 have all, performed very well this season. But I would really like to see some of the other players that we haven't seen much, or maybe seen, really excel in one game, but not really the whole year. I'd really like to see some of them step up. Zach Horton, tight end, he comes to mind. He had a monster game against South Alabama. You have Phoenix Sproles. He's had some good production all year. He had a great game against UVA earlier this season, but really haven't seen much out of him. I think that's kind of really, I feel like there's so much of the offense we still haven't really seen. They haven't really put together a complete performance where everybody's involved, everybody is getting touches, everybody is really producing. And, there's only 60 minutes in a football game, so, you can't have absolutely everybody being amazing. But I would like to see some of the aspects of the offense we haven't really seen much of, and some of the key players, really kind of step up and, become more reliable as we sort of hit the last 4 games of the season.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the receiving crew be consistent. Elijah Surratt and Reggie Brown really have just kind of elevated themselves the past few weeks, and they've said that they both just make each other better. And obviously, like, if you're going to double him, then I'm left one-on-one. And so that's obviously an area I think JMU can continue to hit on, is find the receivers. And Elijah Surratt has scored on the opening drive, it feels like, a lot this season. So we'll see if the offense can kind of continue, I would say, what was a pretty good game, but just fixing up the little things still from them. On to the defensive side of things, we kind of mentioned it. Their run defense was a bit exposed, which still wasn't a terrible game. Like 138 yards is no terrible game by any means, but just to JMU standard this season, it obviously was. And Kirk Cinetti talks about the spread offense that ODU plays and how JMU just kind of didn't really do the right things. And it'll be interesting to see if Georgia State kind of tries to play a similar style, because I think that ODU had maybe the best offensive game against that JMU defense this season. So what are the areas the JMU's defense needs to really key in on going into Atlanta?
As you mentioned, ODU just kind of stood out, and like we mentioned, wasn't an offense that they had really seen this season. So, I mean, like we mentioned earlier, Wilson having those explosive plays, the runs having explosive plays, it just was something that, I don't know, just kind of stood out. Like I mentioned earlier, it felt like an off game. But with the quote-unquote bad, there was also still good that they continue to do each week. Jalen Green had another 2.5 sacks that puts him at 15.5 for the season. James Carpenter had a season high of 9 tackles. Aiden Fisher with a season high of 12. Just, they're still good that just continues to go in, game out from this defense. So I think just making sure that they play consistent and fixing the little mistakes that they just proved to kind of expose them this past week is just really the key to kind of shutting down the Georgia State offense this week.
You know, I think the biggest thing for me is just don't overcorrect. You know, I think that you look at the numbers and they are concerning. 138 rushing yards, 277 passing yards. But, like, let's be real here. The thing that was surprising about ODU wasn't that, you know, it wasn't a bad performance from the defensive line. I mean, it was probably the only not exceptional performance by the defensive line. If anything, it just kind of proved that they're mortal. Like, that they are, like, actual human beings on that line that are stopping the run. So I think the biggest thing is just don't panic. I mean, this is still one of the best defensive lines in the country. And in any other school, you know, if the defensive line allowed 138 rushing yards, they'd be going in the locker room high-fiving each other. They would think that would be a great performance. But for JMU, who's kept, you know, teams to double digits at best all season, you know, it does bring up concerns. But I really think that, you know, and the other side of the coin, you know, you have the secondary. And, you know, 277 passing yards, that's not great. You know, that's not good by any means. But, you know, considering where they're coming from and considering how many yards they've given up in prior matchups, you know, there's still improvement there. So I think the biggest thing is just, you know, is for JMU not to get in their own heads. You know, they're 8-0 right now. They're trying to finish up the season. They have a real shot at going undefeated. They just need to kind of focus game by game, 1-0 mindset. Like Cignetti says, you know, ignore the noise and the clutter, and, you know, just focus on Georgia State.
And the defense came up with a play at the end of the game, once again, getting a sack fumble, and it just seems like time and time again this season that when the game's on the line, one possession game, they come up with a play, and that's why they're 5-0 in one possession games this season. Looking at Georgia State, they're 6-2 on the season, 3-2 a Sun Belt play, losses to Troy and Georgia Southern, who's a team that JMU had their best performance against this season, winning 41-13. So kind of interesting looking at this Georgia State team. What are y'all's thoughts on the Panthers?
Their run game is dangerous. Marcus Carroll leads the Sun Belt with 1,077 yards and averages 132 per game, just what basically ODU had against the Dukes last week. Quarterback Darren Granger, who can pass, is just equally as dangerous on the rush. So just shutting down that rush game this week, especially after last week's performance, is going to be key for the Dukes this week.
Kurt Cignetti has used the term trap game to describe a lot of the matchups. I asked him about that during post-practice meeting on Tuesday, and his response was, well, Georgia State's 6-2. It's not exactly a trap game here. I think, you know, even though they've had 2 bad losses to Troy and to Georgia Southern, they're still one of the best teams in the Sun Belt East. I think if it weren't for the fact that they had lost to Georgia Southern, I would pick them as one of the favorites to win the division, considering that JMU can't. And, you know, last year, they're going in the game with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. Last season, you know, the Panthers came to Harrisonburg. They took a 34-10 lead right before halftime, and JMU was able to come back and win 42-40. You know, one of the kind of bigger comebacks of that season. Of course, we all talk about App, but that was a pretty big game for the Dukes, and Georgia State would end up finishing that year 4-8, 3-5 in the Sun Belt. So this is a very different team, but a lot of the same faces that came to Harrisonburg and almost shocked the Dukes last season. So I think that this is going to be probably their last big test for this rest of the season. Considering that UConn is 1-7, and App and Coastal have both kind of fallen off. Plus that App game is going to be at home, so that's extra advantage for the Dukes. I think that this might end up being their last real big test before the end of the year.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would say that this is JMU's kind of biggest game left of the season, and that if they get past Georgia State tomorrow, that they have a legitimate chance to go undefeated. They're 5.5-point favorites on the road. What are y'all's predictions?
As we've seen from other games this season, I think it's going to be another close one, another 1 or 2 point possession game. I think it'll be a JMU win, though, despite being on the road in Atlanta. I think it'll come out as a 30-28 JMU win.
JMU is 5-0 in one possession games this season. I'm predicting that they're going to go 6-0 with a 28-21 win in Atlanta. They're going to come home 9-0.
I think that it's a big test for JMU, and I think that we've just seen them time and time again just be able to perform in these big games, to just kind of prove a lot of people wrong. And I just think this season that their mindset is just kind of on a different level than maybe even last year when they were 5-0 and things like that. So I think this, like I said, I think it's a huge test for JMU, but I just think coming off of last week, Kirk said, he said coming into this week, the team's mindset felt better in practice, that they were, kind of felt like they were preparing a bit better for Georgia State. And I just think coming off, like we said, kind of what was a wake-up call against ODU, I think they'll want to shut down the run. They'll want to have a big defensive game, and the offense will continue to kind of shine. So I'm going to go with a 27-23 JMU win. I do think it'll be a one-possession game, which we've seen, obviously, JMU's great at. So I think they'll be able to pull it out. And we'll see. And JMU's undefeated season ended in Georgia last year. It was at Georgia Southern, but they'll try not to have that happen again. So we'll have all the live coverage from Atlanta, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching. Kickoff is at 3:30 p.m. on ESPN2 tomorrow, and we will see you soon.